You know what I love about big cities is that there's just so many places that are reference points, like a store or a place you've lived or a place you've been. And sometimes they're not always real.
That's true. I mean, when you read books, for example, a place becomes, all of a sudden, becomes alive, richer.
Yeah, and today we're going to find literary locations through Paris. And a part of this video is sponsored by Google Maps, so we're going to hop on our bikes and see what we can find of literary hangouts or where the classics, some of the spots from books, you know?
Yeah. For example, this street, I think Alexandre Dumas lived here.
He lived at the end of the street.
And
he wrote the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo.
This street is Richelieu, reminds us of the first book of Three Musketeers. So that's the name of the cardinal, but also of the public library, the central library in front of us. Cities, especially world cities, contain multitudes. They contain multitudes, but not also quantifiable multitudes. Like buildings and people, they also contain multitude of references and layers of things that have been imagined.
Okay, so we got one. This is the House of D'Artagnan. Here lived Charles de Batz-Castemore d'Artagnan. It's immortalized by Alexandre Dumas. So basically, this was D'Artagnan's house from the Three Musketeers.
See there's a statue. There we go. So, you know, Molière is very close to the Comédie Française, where playwrights used to just make it or break it.
Did you read the Da Vinci Code? That's where it started, right? There was a murder in the pyramids, the bottom of the pyramid.
That's right.
It's funny because the Louvre Pyramid really was a character, right? Like it starts, you feel like...
It is a character, yes, because it's this sort of Masonic intrigue.
But that's fiction.
It was a shocker when Notre Dame got fire. Part of the reason why a lot of people all over identified with what happened is because the building is more than a building. It's also because of Victor Hugo, because of a book. When you look at there, I also see Esmeralda and Quasimodo. So I do care more when I think about them.
So we're going to the Six arrondissement, which is where Gertrude Stein had her salon. It's also where the Lost Generation hung out in cafes.
They were not the first either. The first Bohemians just coming to Paris. I guess La Bohème, Puccini's La Bohème is all about that too.
Cross or no?
Well, as the tale goes, it was Gertrude Stein who told one of the writers of the moment that they were the lost generation. Fitzgeralds, Hemingway, Dos Passos.
So this was Gertrude Stein's home. This was also her famous literary and artistic salon. So she was friends with Hemingway before he was Hemingway. He was 23 years old and he came to her salon because apparently everyone came with somebody, right? You just had to know somebody who knew her and they'd bring you on Saturday night.
We are approaching the Luxembourg Garden. We can imagine Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. You can imagine Jean Valjean just sitting there with Cosette on a bench. This is the way cities contain multitudes. They are layers upon layers of imagined and historical things happening.
Do you know where to go?
Yes, we are very fast.
This part of the video is sponsored by Google Maps, and really the partial shutdown of my city during COVID has had me re-examining the geography of a place. I've had to remap my daily routines, and that's opened my eyes to a lot of geographical meaning. It's inspired me to want to find and support more local businesses, and Google Maps has a lot of features to help you do that. Today, I've decided to find an English language bookstore. Here's one right next to the Luxembourg Park, the Red Wheelbarrow. It's really easy to find out if a place is taking extra safety precautions, or changing their hours. With all the changing curfews and regulations these days, I rarely leave the house without using maps to check the hours first. Okay, now we're going to go talk to Penelope Fletcher from the Red Wheelbarrow. Oh, there it is, okay. And she agreed to let me in before opening for an interview. Hi. I am. Are you Penelope? Hi. Hi. Nice to meet you. Wow.
So, I see that you say librairie anglophone. You make it obvious.
Yes. Partly it's because I don't want to be seen as a British bookstore or an American bookstore or a Canadian bookstore. It's a bookstore with the books are in English.
And why come to Paris and start an English language bookstore?
So when I was 19, I opened a second-hand bookshop. This is a new bookshop. You can see it was in a caravan, which was actually a converted chicken coop. When I opened it, my French teacher from high school said, "Who do you think you are?" Sylvia Beach. And I'd never heard of Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare Company, which was just down the street from where we are today. And so when I came here in 1990, I thought, I need to find an old-fashioned bookstore with an apartment upstairs, and then everybody who wants to come 2 weeks a year, they can work in their bookstore. It wasn't until 2001, 11 years later, that I opened a bookstore which was called the Red Wheelbarrow Bookstore. And the Red Wheelbarrow is a small haiku poem that goes, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens," or something like that. And then I discovered the first time the poem was ever published in English was in 1923, and it was printed by a printer in Lyon called Durantier. And in fact, Durantier is the same printer that printed Ulysses for Sylvia Beach. Just down the street is where the original Shakespeare Company was, but also there remains today a French bookstore called L'Escalier that where Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Chester Himes all went. Actually, it still is the neighborhood with the most bookstores per square inch of anywhere in the world. This is a theater bookshop. So this is what's happened to Sylvia's bookstore. This just says this is where she published Ulysses. And she closed here in World War II when the Gestapo wanted to know if she would sell them a copy of Finnegan's Wake. And she refused to sell a copy of Finnegan's Wake. And so she had 4 hours to close the store and get out of there. That was the end of Shakespeare Company when the war came.
Talking about the role of bookstores, reading Hemingway's Movable Feast, he talks about the fact that that library was much more than a library for authors.
The bookstore, yes, because she did what we do too. But we're actually going to publish a book as well. And James Joyce, he was a real pain. I opened up a book and he was asking for her to lend him money, and she put all her money into it. And a lot of the same problems that I go through, this sort of constant struggle. It's too bad this bookstore's closed, because this one he took over from his father, and it's a beautiful secondhand bookstore. I think Paris is still a very doable place in some ways. A lot of people actually manage to be a writer in Paris because it is the city where you can still come and write, I think. I think because you can normally go to cafes and you don't have to drive, you don't have to know how to drive. And I think that's one of the things, is that Paris allows a space for someone.
Thanks again to Google Maps for sponsoring that part of my video. Now on to the rest of my video.
So now we're going to Les Deux Magots, which is a really famous cafe for writers for generations, actually.
So there is a reason why the cafes and public libraries were so important for writing and literature in this city. It's because it was cold and apartments were not heated. The only way to work long hours in a cozy place was to just go to a cheap cafe.
So this is Les Deux Magots, which they call a literary cafe. That's even what it says on the side of the building. Everybody's come here. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Jean-Paul Sartre, Beauvoir, James Joyce. Really, every generation writers would come, and they sought refuge here because, there was heat, and they'd go up to the second floor and write. And actually, Hemingway was one of those. He wrote most of The Sun Also Rises here.
So this is the street where James Baldwin lived. He stayed in they were probably just residence hotels at the time, but now they've been turned into hotels.
He lived here with other struggling artists and writers, and he said that he wanted to be here because he wanted to find his identity somewhere else other than 1948 America.
It was also probably a way to, this last generation had done. A lot of people just had come here and had found a way to sort of relate to their home places, right?
Yeah, Gertrude Stein actually says that every writer needs two countries, one where they're from and the other one where they're sort of not from, so they can then write about the place where they're from, right?
It's interesting that, the same street just had so much talent, right?
And actually just 2 blocks over is where Oscar Wilde died and where Borges lived.
The Argentinian writer?
Argentinian writer, yeah.
There we go, I've seen it.
This was home of Oscar Wilde, and it's also where he died. And then it's where Borges came because he wanted to die where Oscar Wilde died, though he didn't.
And it's also, if you go far enough back to the 16th century, it's also where Queen Margot de Valois, and she became wife of Henry IV, and she lived here. And actually, Alexandre Dumas wrote a book about her called Queen Margot.
So this, you go back enough centuries, you find a queen who lived here as well.
So the author of The Three Musketeers is also connected to the same place. How crazy is that?
So this is Rue du Vieux Colombier, and it's where Porthos, one of the Three Musketeers, lived.
There's Paris that is the myth, and it is the myth. The city is way more complex than I think what we project onto it. And yet it does retain some of its magic. A really pertinent factor is that France supports literature.
Comme je descendais des fleuves impassibles, je ne me sentis plus guidée par les alleurs.
Authors are famous and they achieve the same kind of fame as actors would. It's a completely different level of veneration that the culture has for writers. So this is the American Library in Paris. Our roots are really in the Library War Service. So the American Library Association, along with the Library of Congress, and basically every public library in the United States sent books to soldiers at the tail end of the First World War. All right. So it was out of that collection that the American Library was founded. So we're closed today. We have the run of the place. So we pulled stuff from the archives. This is our first collection of newsletters, and you can see Ernest Hemingway wrote for our newsletter, Gertrude Stein wrote for our newsletter. We have this Americans in France directory from the 20s. So this was Facebook before Facebook existed. Wharton is probably in here, let me see. We've had different literary figures involved in the life of the library for 100 years. Edith Wharton was one of our first trustees. Then we had Henry Miller, Anais Nin, John Dos Passos. They were frequent visitors. I pulled Henry Miller's letter to us. I love the just onion skin paper, so from 1938, with his address. He's asking if we have specific books: The Secret Doctrine, The Tibetan Book of the Dead, Esoteric Buddhism, Walt Whitman's prose works, and any book on Zen Buddhism. Sincerely yours, Henry Miller. He was a frequent visitor to the library, and in one of his published works, he actually references on his to-do list to steal books from the American Library in Paris, which obviously we do not support, but we thought it's funny because his books, or Tropic of Cancer, is one of the most often stolen books in public libraries, and even our copy had been stolen, so there's a little karmic retribution there. Oh yeah, Sylvia Beach gives 5,000 books to American Library in Paris, so Sylvia Beach was the founder of the original Shakespeare Company. We received Marlene Dietrich's personal library, so we've got some great items from her that she annotated. Not true. This is, without a doubt, the worst writing I ever laid eyes on. So this is our main reading room. We're the largest English language lending library on the European continent now. We have 100,000 volumes. Another interesting episode from our history was in the McCarthy era, agents were sent to Europe to look at objectionable material. And so McCarthy's agents, Cohn and Shine, visited the library and asked to see if we had certain materials, and we turned them away and said, we're closed and confidentiality is very important. So that's one proud moment for us. And we did stay open during the Second World War. And Janet Skesley and Charles just wrote a novel, it's now on all of the bestseller lists, about the staff who were at the library during the Second World War and kept it open and actually launched a clandestine lending service to Jewish patrons during that time.
Do you think that Paris is still kind of, I guess it was a refuge at one point for people.
I think so. I mean, there's certainly something about the freedom of escape, and Paris was a place that you could be free to express yourself, and you saw that time and time again. And I hope that stays. I think social media has put a damper on that a little bit because you don't have the anonymity that you once had to arrive in a cosmopolitan city and create your own identity. And I think that's what artists have been doing, since the beginning of time, just reinventing themselves again and again.
Got it. Yeah.
Okay, so Edith Wharton lived here from 1910 to 1920. She wrote The Age of Innocence while living here. It says here she was the first novelist from the United States who emigrated to France out of love for this country and its culture.
Because then after her, a lot of writers came. So she left in 1920, and that was really when the Lost Generation started coming, and I think she felt like the city was kind of getting too crowded.
So this is one of the four casts of the Auguste Rodin statue of the writer Honoré de Balzac.
Apparently Balzac, when he talked, was super mercurial. Sometimes he would come like this and make a big point. It was very controversial because nobody liked it. Not even the commissioners who had hired Rodin to do it. Anyway, one of the casts is kept at the garden of the Musée Rodin.
This is a museum, so whoever just was thinking about positioning the statue we're going to see, which is Balzac's statue, the same statue we've seen on the street, was thinking about actually the gesture of the statue itself, which is kind of like looking at you but just turning. So you are walking through here, so you go through the thinker, you face this thinker, you say, what an interesting, and then you just meander and just get in here. We say, well, where is Balzac? So we just keep meandering as we think and keep going. And it's sort of like a game. It's like a peekaboo game. He's hiding from us. Balzac, where is the writer? He's hiding from us. Did they move it? It's becoming a joke. Hey, Mr. Balzac. He was in there. And you know what? He just really hid from us. So let's ask. Est-ce que la statue de Balzac? C'est pas là?
Non, ça a été déplacé.
D'accord. Et
normalement, il est bien là. Hein.
C'est pas dans le
On
musée.
peut pas le voir, il n'est pas accessible.
Ah, d'accord. Et il est bien là, mais il n'est pas là maintenant. D'accord, merci. They moved it. As you would go out of the thinker, and you'd sort of see Balzac just peeking from the corner of his eye, just peeking at you.
So this is Rue de Varenne, which is the same street where down the street is Edith Wharton's house.
Okay, so in 1908, the poet Rainier Marie Rilke was living in an apartment here.
He moved here and told his friend Auguste Rodin that this would be a great place to have a studio. And I think this was abandoned at the time. It was like an abandoned courtyard. And so Rodin moved in here and made his studio here, and now it's the Rodin Museum. I find it interesting that everything's so close here. It's still, again, so dense. Actually, Wharton and Rilke and Rodin were contemporaries here at the same time, but they probably never met because they weren't in the same circles. But they were living just within yards of each other.
Since you do tiny houses sometimes, or let's say whimsical places to work and live, and you know, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, one of the main characters, the kid Gavroche, he actually lives inside of a hollow statue, an elephant which actually was real.
Do you want to go to Bastille?
French Revolution. Okay, so how does it start? Well, it starts with
The storming of the Bastille prison, right?
Exactly. Then we have a problem. You have a hole. You have a place. You know, you have to do something to commemorate. So there is this idea.
It was Napoleon's idea.
Paris wants to be the new Rome, and here, well, what can we put here? Well, how about a big elephant?
So it didn't work out because they built the plaster model and then never built the full.
They let the plaster model sitting around. So decades after, Victor Hugo says, okay, we are going to play with that in Les Miserables. So a character that to me is central, Gavroche, he's wise, street smart, but he's also wise. He has real wisdom. Gavroche sleeps inside of the plaster model of the elephant, of the statue that never get built here.
Elephant house.
This is a video of the elephant, of Gavroche Elephant House.
There is this concept called psychogeography. Maps are a layer. There is a very rational layer on top of something, let's say a city, and a map is just coordinates. Concepts such as psychogeography tell you that places such as vibrant cities are way more than this sort of cold grid. There are layers upon layers upon layers of experiences and also of things imagined and real blended together and intermingling in a rich way. Maps and stories, layers on top of them, also tell stories to those who cannot visit and make them approachable. So even when you are celebrating from a distance, you can feel connected.